Okay, so at some point you are going to need to sharpen your chisel, probably a lot sooner than you think. It's always good to have sharp tools, as everyone probably says, because it makes your work easier, it's safer, you've got less of a chance of pushing too hard and stabbing through your hand, for example. So keep your chisels sharp. So what I've done with this chisel is put lots of different bevels on it. I've made it an absolute state. So again, this is similar to some of the stuff that I see people bring into store. It's got a few different bevels on it, and also I've dropped it a few times like that, and that has started denting the edge. I've also stabbed it on the Tormek brick a few times. This chisel is well and truly well and truly gone. How do you get rid of that? To start with, we're going to begin with the Tormek. Okay, the Tormek is going to be used to grind the main primary bevel on these chisels. I'm not going to use it to do the final polishing or anything like that. It's just going to be to grind the primary bevel. If you're not sure what primary bevel means, I'll show you that now. Okay, so if you look at this blade, you may see that there is actually two bevels on it. So we've got this main large one here, which is the primary bevel. This is usually ground at 25 degrees, which is what I'll be doing on the Tormek. And then on the very end here, you'll see there's a very small bevel, and that is called the secondary bevel, and that is usually ground at 30 degrees. The reason we have two bevels on these is primarily to make sharpening easier. 30 degrees, this secondary bevel on the end, is our cutting edge. So you might be asking, why put this 25 on there? Why not just grind the whole thing at 30 degrees? Well, the reason is because there is obviously going to be a lot more metal there if it's all ground at 30 degrees. So that means when you take it to your stone, it's going to take a lot more effort to polish that entire edge. Whereas if you have a 25 degree primary bevel, and then you're only polishing 30 degrees on the very edge, you're removing a lot less metal, and as a result, it's just much quicker. The reason it's 25 degrees and 30 degrees is just because that's standard practice I've been taught, and I haven't personally seen a need to change that yet. There are some other makers, David Charlesworth off the top of my head, who endorses sharpening, I think it's 32 degrees on the end. He's obviously done his own experiments, that's obviously what works for him. But as a general rule, you'll probably be taught to sharpen 25 degrees as a primary bevel and 30 degrees on the very end. And that gives you a good balance between the longevity of that edge and the sharpness of it as well. Okay, so before we do anything, let's look at this edge. So you can see that on the corners here, they have been taken off from where I just dropped it on the floor. You can see that there's a bevel there, there's a bevel there, there's like a round over bit here. There is some remnants of a secondary bevel on there, but overall, it's all over the place. There is no consistency to any sharpening on there, and as a result, that is going to be very difficult to sharpen. So the key to sharpening is consistency, and giving yourself a good grounding to start with is essential. So it's for that reason that I'm going to begin with the Tormek. So before I start anything, I can hear a lot of you saying, but Matt, I don't have a Tormek. You're just assuming that we own equipment of this size. Now, I don't actually own this. This was just lent to me. For years, I was actually using my 400 and 1000 grit combination stone. So 400 grit on that side, that's for my rough grinding, 1000 to do the secondary bevel on the end. That worked fine for me. Yes, it was a lot of effort, but that is what you pay for a Tormek for. You pay for the convenience. So with that in mind, the first thing I need to do with this is make sure the stone is actually true. Now, this is not a Tormek demonstration by any means, but I do want to stress that if you are using any sort of powered equipment, the stone does need to be true in there. So I'm just going to ping this across the stone, get it all nice and true, and I will see you on the other side. Okay, so that's all sorted. I'm just going to get my chisel in the square edge jig now. Lock it all down, pop that on the bar. So the bar is now perfectly parallel to the top of the stone. Set the stone diameter, which I know to be around that. Set the angles 25 and just adjust it until I get the right angle. There we go. So that is now at 25 degrees to the stone, and I'm going to start grinding the main primary bevel. So this is actually almost already done. It's taken about 10 seconds so far. Obviously that bevel was quite close to 25 degrees before, despite having lots of different facets on it. But let's get that finished off, get rid of all of those remaining marks and get that to a completely flat 25 degree primary bevel. Okay, so that's taken about 30 seconds so far, and most of the bevel is there. There is just one corner, probably from where I dropped it on the floor just now, that is slightly dipped off from the edge. And that's important that I still get rid of that, because when I polish the secondary bevel on the end, that nicked off corner can still affect that. So let's carry on, get rid of that completely. And there we go. Right, so that nick is all completely gone off the corner. We have a perfectly uniform primary bevel on here at 25 degrees. Now, what a lot of people are led to believe when they buy Toolbox is that they should do everything on it, including secondary bevels, sharpen the edge, and just ready to use from here. I don't really agree with that. I think that it's very easy to waste too much metal on these machines, and it should be used sparingly. And what I mean by that is using it only to grind the primary bevel. So what you'll see some people do is they'll grind their primary bevel on it, they'll get this stone grader onto it, take that to a 1000 grit now, because this has 2 different grits on it, get that all nice and shiny, take it to the wheel on here and give yourself a nice polished edge and call it sharp. Which it is, but you're just grinding away so much metal. You have paid for this. Why turn it into slurry that's going to end up in here? Use this sparingly, is what I would advise. So what I'm going to do now, instead of taking this to the 1000 grit on here, I'm actually going to turn this machine off and I'm going to take it to the 1000 grit on my Waterstone. Okay, so my Waterstone has been soaking, and what I'm going to do is flatten the 6000 grit, the finer side, on this diamond plate. If you want to know why I'm using Waterstones for this, watch my previous video on sharpening stones, and that will also tell you why I'm happy to use Waterstones on my lovely workbench. So that slurry is all on there. I'm just going to wash that off of here, and then the 1000 grit side on this stone as well. The reason I did it in this order is because if I did the 1000 grit first, got all the stone covered in slurry, and then flipped it to the 6000 grit side, it's going to contaminate this fine side with the coarse grit on the opposite side. So get that all nice and flat. There we go. So wash that off. Now, if you have watched my previous video, you can see why it's good to have a designated sharpening station for this, because this has already made a bit of a mess. So now, chisel is in the honing guide. If you don't know why I'm using this honing guide, watch my first video on honing guides, why I've chosen it over the Veritas one, why I've chosen it over a standard eclipse pattern. There is reason for why I use this, other than the fact it's Lie-Nielsen and very shiny. So we have ground 25 degrees as our primary bevel. We're now going to sharpen 30 degrees for our secondary bevel. So that is up against my 30 degree stop, locked in place. Right, so we'll start with 1000 grit. Bit of water on there. And all I'm going to do here is keep this nice and even pressure on here and just drag back. I'm going to use the whole stone. And that's all it really needs, just a few strokes to get that secondary bevel started. And then what we'll do, we'll flip it over. And it's good practice here, especially with Waterstones, because of the whole grit contamination thing. This wheel on the bottom can pick up coarse grit from the 1000 grit stone and then contaminate it onto this 6000. So wipe the wheel first, or wipe the bevel, and there we go, we're ready to go. So again, just going to drag back a few times. Using the entire stone. There we go. We've got a nice even secondary bevel along the end there, so that's at 30 degrees. And then our main primary bevel is at 25, but you see how minimal effort that was. I think I did 3 strokes on there, and then I did maybe 5 or 6 on this 6000 grit, and that has given us a sharp edge. If I was grinding this at 25, that is going to take far more effort because there is a lot more metal to remove. So, secondary bevel established. Let me just get this undone. And so what that has done is it's folded a bit of metal up over the edge here, so it's created a small burr, and you can actually feel that when you do this. So it's called a burr, and you need to get rid of that. So the way to do that instead of dropping it onto the stone like this, it's usually best to bring it on like this with very light pressure and then just rub it back and forth a few times. And this is the importance with keeping your stones flat. If your stones are concave, you can see that I'm going to start rounding that chisel back up, and it's not going to be a good reference surface to work from. So I'm just going to do this a little bit more, and that's pretty much all it needs, if that. So there we go, that's a nice even finish across the back of the blade. I could give it a little bit more, but I can see that the edge is perfectly polished. Next, what I will do is get my strop and put some of this super fine paste on it. I'm pretty sure this is too fine to even use on chisels, but I like it. So a few dabs of that, get it off your finger. Right, what I'm going to do here, pop the chisel on it and then just lift it up until I see the small shadow on the end disappear, and then I can just drag it back a bit. This is the only time you'll see me freehand anything to do with sharpening. So it's just dragging it back. So when I flatten the back of the chisel, that would have folded little bits of burr back over onto this edge, and that's what this strop is doing. It's removing those, but very gently. If you snap off that burr, it just gives you a blunt edge again, and you're back to square one. So you've got to remove that burr very gently. One thing I will say here, I know the height of this strop's okay, but if you're working on stones that are very low, just remember that some handles poke out below that chisel. So when you put them on a stone like this, that handle could accidentally be cranking it up somewhat. Like I say, this strop's fine, but on some diamond stones, it can be an issue. So there we go, back and forth a few times. Get rid of all that rubbish that's left on the end there. Give ourselves some more roll. And there we go. That chisel is, let's call it stupidly sharp. That is just easily taking hairs off the back of my hand. I could easily shave half my body with that, should I wish. But that is how you sharpen a chisel. 25-degree primary bevel, 30-degree secondary bevel. Just try that out to start with. Maybe you'll end up changing the angle somewhat, but that's the general rule, and that's how easy it is. It's nothing complicated. A few strokes on your sharpening stone, whether that's a diamond stone, water stone, a couple of strokes on a strop, and you're ready to go. So after using that chisel for a while, obviously that edge is going to blunt again. What you do not want to be doing now is taking that back to the tool mech and grinding the 25 degrees on again and then the 30-degree secondary bevel, because that is just a complete waste of time. This is where a secondary bevel is handy, because you can just put it back in the honing guide, lock it up at 30 degrees, and then just go, you don't even need to go to the 1000 grit stone here half the time, just go back to your 6000, do a few more strokes, get a nice fresh edge on that, take it out, polish the back of that, take it on your strop, there we go, nice fresh edge again. So over time, obviously that secondary bevel is going to get bigger and it's going to work its way further up the blade. Now, there is no written rule to this, but by the time it gets to around a third or half of the way up that primary bevel, that's where I feel I need to regrind the primary bevel and get it started fresh again. Otherwise, the only reason to take it back to the tool mech before the secondary bevel works its way halfway up the primary bevel is if you drop it on the floor and you take a massive nick out the corner, for example. That's when you want to start regrinding it and get it back to a uniform position. But most of the time, that's why sharpening a secondary bevel is so quick. You're removing a lot less material, which is obviously less effort and less metal wasted, which is always good. So there we go. That is how you get a sharp edge on a chisel. Now, like I said, tool mech, not everyone has access to one of these. I would advise either getting a 400 grit diamond stone or a 400 to 240 grit water stone. Those will grind away the material very quickly, but bear in mind with the water stone, you need to keep it flat as well. If you haven't watched my previous video on sharpening stones, be sure to watch that before you go ahead and buy anything to do that. And also, if you do need to grind the primary bevel by hand, make sure you use a honing guide. Again, you cannot get that 25 degrees accurate without one of these, especially if you're a beginner. Alternatives to the tool mech would be using a high-speed grinder, but with a high-speed grinder, you've got to be very careful about heating the steel on high carbon blades. So think chisels and plane blades, for example. If you heat them up too much, it ruins the metal, makes it really soft, and you'll basically have to throw that blade away. It will be no use to you from there. If you're going to do it on a high-speed grinder, take a little bit off, dip it in water, a little bit off, dip it in water, and just keep doing that until you get your primary bevel established. Otherwise, find a friend who owns a tool mech, or lots of tool shops actually do regrinding of bevels, so you can specify what angle you want, they can take it away, get it reground to a nice flat 25 degrees, and you're ready to go again. Just keep doing your 30-degree secondary bevels until you need to regrind it, in which case do exactly what you did before. So hopefully that has demystified sharpening chisels for you. It's really not a difficult process. Plain blades in the next video will be a little bit more difficult, but overall, really not much to worry about these. Just make sure you keep everything nice and square, nice and controlled. You'll be fine. If you want more information on sharpening to make sure you get the correct setup from the get-go, watch my previous videos and watch it right through to the end, because I'll be sharing lots of information on tips that I've learned at Reichert Wood, on things that I've seen and learned at Axminster. There's a lot to be learned, so hopefully I can help you out with it, and happy sharpening. Happy sharpening, yeah.